Imagine if your expensive fish finder, a box full of premium lures, and your entire tackle collection could be outperformed by two tiny pieces of metal. Sounds hard to believe, right? I thought the same at first. But the more I looked into it, the more it started to make perfect sense. We're talking about nothing more than ordinary copper and zinc attached to a standard steel fishing hook. No batteries, no wires, and no complicated electronics. The moment the hook enters the water, a natural reaction begins between the different metals. That's where things get interesting. A very weak electrical field forms around the hook. We can't detect it ourselves, but fish experience it in a completely different way. To them, it's like a signal that's almost impossible to ignore. Some species can detect incredibly tiny electrical impulses. Because of that, the hook doesn't just look like another bait resting on the bottom. Instead, it resembles a wounded baitfish that's easy to catch. That subtle signal often encourages fish to investigate your bait much faster. What surprised me even more is how few anglers know about this. Some insist that success depends only on heavy chumming and finding the perfect spot. Others spend hundreds of dollars on the newest lures and high-end gear. Yet very few realize that this idea has been around for thousands of years. Archaeologists have discovered copper fishing hooks dating back to the days of ancient Egypt, and many other early civilizations used similar designs. It wasn't superstition or luck. They simply noticed something that modern science can explain with basic physics. When copper touches steel underwater, they create a small galvanic reaction that produces a tiny electrical current. Add a small piece of zinc, and the signal develops a faint pulse. What's remarkable is that this pulse closely resembles the electrical vibrations produced by an injured baitfish, exactly the kind of signal that species like catfish, carp, crucian carp, and bream are especially sensitive to, even at night or in muddy water. Catfish, in particular, have highly developed electroreceptors that allow them to detect extremely weak electrical signals. That's why the old advice that only scent, depth, or bait matters doesn't tell the whole story. Water temperature, oxygen levels, barometric pressure, current, and even weak electrical fields all play a role in whether fish decide to bite. That's why anglers sometimes run into a situation that seems impossible to explain. You've mixed a great ground bait, picked a promising spot, and done everything by the book, but the fish simply won't bite. Meanwhile, someone just a few yards away is catching one fish after another. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe something else is making the difference. There's a simple trick that doesn't get talked about very often. Wrap a few turns of bare copper wire around a regular steel hook and add a small piece of zinc. Before casting, simply dip the hook into the same water you're fishing. The reaction starts almost immediately. Suddenly, your nightcrawler, maggot, or kernel of sweet corn becomes more than just bait. A faint electrical signal forms around it, helping fish locate it faster. But don't jump to conclusions, there's an important catch. Not every species responds the same way. Some fish are noticeably more sensitive to these signals, while others show very little reaction. That's why experienced anglers test ideas like this on the water instead of accepting every claim at face value. Once you try this on a local lake, river, or gravel pit, another interesting detail becomes obvious. The scent from ground bait works, but it spreads through the water fairly slowly. A weak electrical signal, on the other hand, appears almost instantly. In moving water, that difference can matter. Sometimes fish arrive at the hook before the scent trail has even had a chance to develop. That's one reason why this technique can occasionally produce faster bites than expected. There's another common misconception. Many people assume fish see the bait first. But for bottom-feeding species like carp, crucian carp, bream, catfish, and tench, the process often works differently. They detect potential food before they actually see it. A regular hook with a worm may only be noticed once a fish gets very close. But when copper and zinc create a weak electrical signal, it can resemble the subtle bioelectric activity of an injured baitfish. the kind of signal many fish naturally investigate first. Even so, it's important to keep realistic expectations. This effect is most noticeable with bottom-dwelling species such as carp, crucian carp, tench, and catfish. Predators like bass or pike rely much more on movement and vision, so you shouldn't expect identical results from every species. That's why some old fishing advice still works remarkably well, while other tips don't always deliver. Choosing the right location or fishing during the early morning bite can make a real difference. But simply throwing in more chum isn't always the answer. Fish may be swimming only a few feet away and still never find your bait. If you decide to try this technique, a few small details matter. Use bare copper wire without any insulation and wrap 4 or 5 tight turns around the shank of a standard steel hook. Then attach a small piece of zinc so it touches both the copper and the hook itself. There's also one little trick that many experienced anglers rarely mention. Before you cast, lightly scratch the copper wire with your fingernail or the edge of a knife. Exposing fresh metal helps the reaction start more efficiently, creating a slightly stronger electrical signal. It's a tiny step, but one that seasoned anglers often never skip. Once you begin testing this setup on different lakes, rivers, and ponds, the results can sometimes be surprisingly noticeable. There are days when the difference between a regular hook and this simple modification is easy to see. It naturally raises a question: if it's so simple, why don't more people talk about it? Just look at the fishing market today. Every year brings new fish finders, underwater cameras, electronic gadgets, and expensive tackle. Yet some of the most interesting ideas cost only a few cents. Of course, no small piece of copper is going to replace modern fishing equipment. But it's probably not something that should be dismissed either. Some old techniques have simply been forgotten, even though the science behind them hasn't changed. The explanation is straightforward. Water naturally contains dissolved minerals and salts. When different metals come into contact in that environment, they create a small galvanic reaction that produces a very weak electrical field around the hook. Humans can't detect it at all, but many fish can sense these tiny changes through specialized electroreceptors along their lateral line, around the head, and near the mouth. Picture a worm resting quietly on the bottom. Long before a fish actually sees it, that faint electrical signal may already be helping the bait stand out underwater. As the current gently moves the bait, a faint electrical signal continues to surround the hook. For fish like carp, crucian carp, or catfish, it can resemble the signal of an easy meal. That's one reason fish may sometimes locate your bait much faster than you'd expect. You've probably seen this happen yourself. Two anglers are fishing only a few yards apart. They're using nearly identical ground bait and the same bait on their hooks, yet the results are completely different. One angler barely gets a couple of bites, while the other is landing fish one after another. Why does it happen? The answer isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's the smallest details that make the biggest difference: a sharper hook, better presentation, or even a simple piece of copper wire that most people never think about. That said, it's important to keep your expectations realistic. This isn't a miracle trick. If fish simply aren't feeding, no modification will force them to bite. Sudden cold fronts, changing barometric pressure, or low oxygen levels can slow feeding activity dramatically. Water temperature plays a huge role as well. Carp are most active in warmer water and become much less aggressive when temperatures drop. Crucian carp tolerate cooler conditions a little better, while catfish usually don't begin feeding heavily until the water has warmed up. That's why successful fishing always comes down to three things working together: choosing the right location, understanding fish behavior, and preparing your tackle properly. Now let's look at how to build this hook yourself in just a few minutes. You won't need any expensive materials, just a regular steel fishing hook, about 4 inches of bare copper wire, and a small piece of zinc or a tiny galvanized washer. Wrap the copper wire tightly around the hook shank 4 or 5 times, making sure it stays in firm contact with the steel. Then attach the zinc so it touches both the copper and the hook. Before your first cast, dip the rig into the same water you'll be fishing and lightly scrape the copper with your fingernail to remove the thin oxidation layer. That's it, your setup is ready. You can fish with almost any bait, nightcrawlers, maggots, sweet corn, dough, or cooked barley. Sweet corn and dough work especially well for carp and crucian carp. Maggots are a favorite for bream, while catfish often prefer worms or cut bait. The key difference is that your bait may now be easier for fish to detect underwater. There's one more mistake many anglers make. Don't cast this type of rig directly into thick weeds or heavy vegetation. It works much better over clean bottom near a drop-off, the edge of a channel, or the seam where the current changes. Those are the areas where fish naturally travel while searching for food, giving the electrical signal a better chance to do its job. At the same time, it's important to understand the limits of this technique. It won't attract fish that simply aren't there. If you've chosen the wrong spot, neither copper nor the most expensive tackle will save the day. But when fish are already feeding in the area, this modified hook may help them locate your bait more quickly. Sometimes the results are surprising. While every float around you sits perfectly still, yours slowly begins to slide beneath the surface. Then another bite follows, and another. Before long, the anglers nearby start asking what your secret is. The truth is, there's no magic involved. The best fishing knowledge has always been passed from one angler to another through first-hand experience and countless hours on the water. So don't take anyone's word for it, including mine. Build a few of these hooks, fish them side by side with regular ones, and see what happens for yourself. In the end, a real angler trusts the fish, not the stories. If this technique works on your local waters, be sure to share your results with other anglers. That's how the best fishing ideas survive, improve over time, and help people catch more fish year after year.